The year is 165 BCE. Your people, the Israelites, have lived under the rule of foreign kings for centuries. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Egypt, Syria. The latest king, the most cruel of them all, decided to force your people to assimilate to his culture. Abandon the Torah, abandon the God of Israel, assimilate or face death. To drive his point home, this king did the most unconscionable thing. His forces marched into Jerusalem, right into the temple, and sacrificed a pig to a statue of Zeus. With the temple profaned and people fearfully assimilating, some of the priests vowed to fight back. They would wage a holy war and retake their land, but they were outnumbered, and their leader had been killed. Your way of life is coming to an end. Could this be the end? The end of all things? It must be. But you know the scriptures, the prophets. They talked about these events. Foreign rulers, the climatic war, a holy remnant. They said this would happen. And they said God would intervene. God would raise the dead, punishing those people who did evil and rewarding the people who endured suffering to remain faithful. And your group, the special elite few, would receive the greatest reward. You would shine like stars, like the angels. The end is near. You have to tell people this conflict is part of God's plan, that they need to continue trusting God because the reward was so close. So how do you do it? Write a book, grab their attention, tell a story of monsters prowling the earth. Tell how the fourth monster will be the last one. The worst of them all, seeking to destroy everything in its path. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces and stomping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. Daniel 7. God will intervene. When the book of Daniel was written around the year 165 BCE, the author was living in the middle of an unfolding crisis, now called the Maccabean revolt. Named for that family of priests who fought back, the author wrote his book to share his perspective, assuring his comrades that God would strike down the person responsible, the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes. That someone would believe something like this was not by itself unusual. The biblical prophets are full of predictions about God overthrowing kings and kingdoms. What helped the book of Daniel latch onto public imagination so quickly was the way the author chose to share his beliefs. He told colorful stories. He regaled his readers with tales about a Jewish sage living in a foreign land, illustrating how they were supposed to continue obeying the Torah even when their lives were threatened. Amid these stories, the author told his readers over and over, God is in control. God decides which kingdoms rise and which ones fall. He has a plan that guides the course of history. And now, this course was nearing its end. Antiochus would be the last foreign king to rule over Israel. His desecration of the temple had kicked off a countdown of 1,150 days. When this deadline arrived, evil would be defeated and the temple purified. Daniel encoded his predictions through animal symbolism, Aesop's fable for the end times. Quick update for everybody. MVP-Courses just released another outstanding course called Myths Borrowed by the Old Testament with the Syriologist and Bible scholar Joshua Bowen. He has extensive knowledge of the languages and takes any student who signs up for the 7-lecture course into the various older myths like the Gilgamesh epic, the Enuma Elish, Adapa and the South Wind, Marduk and Tiamat, the Ugaritic pantheon with El, Asherah, and their 70 children, and he shows you how even older Mesopotamian cultures borrowed and changed their earlier myths, like the Anzu myth informing the Enuma Elish. You won't want to miss this course, I promise you. Everyone can sign up and watch the lectures at your own pace. You will own the course for life. The course provides additional resources for your studies as well. Sign up today for Myths Borrowed by the Old Testament at www.mythvisionpodcast.com/OT-myths. That's Old Testament-myths. And check out our other courses by world-class academics at www.mvp-courses.com. Now let's get back to the documentary. The Book of Daniel was not unique for these literary choices. While it is the only book like it found in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is just one among many other books from a genre we call apocalypse. Apocalypses were usually fairly popular for several centuries in ancient Judaism, as well as early Christianity. Apocalypse means an unveiling, a disclosure, a revelation. Like any genre, apocalypses drew from a well of common tropes. The most popular one was for the author to pretend to be a person who had lived hundreds or thousands of years ago. This made his descriptions about events from his past look like ancient predictions about the future. That way, when the author began to write about whatever contemporary crisis was unfolding, such as the Maccabean revolt, his readers could safely trust he knew how the crisis would end. Daniel happens to be among the earliest of the Jewish apocalypses, and the book gained widespread acceptance as a legitimate prophecy throughout Judaism within only a few decades. But, like most other apocalypses, Daniel made the mistake of being too specific. The author names which kingdoms were involved in the countdown to the end times. He even specifies the exact number of days the end times would last before God stepped in to right all the wrongs. 1,150 days. In fact, when the original deadline passed with nothing to show for it, the author simply added a new deadline near the end of the book, 1,290 days. And when that one came and went, he added a third deadline, 1,335 days. When Antiochus Epiphanes died, though not at all like how the Book of Daniel said he would, and the revolt came to its natural conclusion, the author's predictions about the end of the world and the resurrection of the dead were left unable to be fulfilled. Someone looking in from the outside at this failed prophecy would naturally assume that anyone who once believed in Daniel's prophetic legitimacy would give up that belief. How could someone stay in a movement after its failure became obvious? This assumption, as rational as it may seem, underestimates the ability of the human mind to dodge, duck, dip, and dive around cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance happens when a person is confronted with two incompatible ideas.
It's as if you have two fuel gauges on your car. They're studying the same amount of fuel, but one says your tank is full, the other registers empty. They can't both be right.
On the one hand, the person has this deeply held conviction which governs their whole worldview. This is how they see God, history, prophecy, friends, enemies, love, or even food, whatever it might be. On the other hand, the person is suddenly confronted with information which essentially disproves the validity of that conviction. Now there is a war going on within the person's mind. For many people, this sort of cognitive dissonance can be extremely stressful. It is not just the clash between two opinions over something trivial. This is their whole worldview being challenged. They have based their whole life, their identity, on this worldview being correct. Now this new information says their worldview is wrong.
Nope.
In all cases, the person must find some strategy to reduce the conflict happening in their mind. Unfortunately, for many people, the strategy they find is to bury their head in the sand. They reject the new information outright. It's gossip and hearsay from gullible busybodies. It's a conspiracy from imposters hiding in their community. It's a lie from the devil himself. Intending to overthrow their faith in God, the person builds a wall around their worldview to protect it, occasionally modifying the wall, adding to it defenses.
For instance, there's the argument from... No, that's garbage.
When new challenges come along, they get rid of their cognitive dissonance by simply blocking out the information they don't like, no matter how valid it might be.
Thanks to denial, I'm immortal.
The book of Daniel can't be wrong. No. The error's not with that book of prophecy, but with how we're reading it. That's it. That's the problem. The book is fine. We've just misread it. Apocalyptic groups have demonstrated this approach to failed prophecy many times throughout history. Within the last 20 years, one example drew worldwide attention. In 2005, a radio evangelist named Harold Camping began predicting that Jesus would return to the earth on May 21st of the year 2011.
2,000 billboards proclaiming the day is coming. Tomorrow.
You and I are living at the time of the end of the world.
As the date approached, he and his followers ramped up an awareness campaign, urging the world to repent for their sins before it was too late.
But Camping is certain he won't be available to talk about it tomorrow.
There's no way that I could schedule an interview because I won't be here.
When May 2011 passed, without the heavens opening for the return of the Messiah, Camping's movement suddenly faced enormous cognitive dissonance. The entire world had seen the prediction fail. Or maybe Camping had made a simple error somewhere in his prediction. Camping wound up insisting that something important did actually happen on May 21st on the spiritual plane. But he also insisted that Jesus was still going to return, seen by all in the world, on a recalculated date in October of the same year.
Christian radio host Harold Camping apologized yesterday for insisting the world would end this past Saturday. He now says that was only a spiritual judgment, an invisible judgment. He says it will actually take 5 months for the fireball to arrive that will consume Earth.
When a prophecy seems to fail, it's extremely common for the people who believed in that prophecy to resort to these exact two strategies to overcome their cognitive dissonance: spiritualizing the prophecy, turning something intended as literal into non-literal so no one can prove it didn't happen, and recalculating the prophecy, tweaking the math to push the time of fulfillment to a later date. Conveniently, these solutions are always discovered after the prophecy as originally given has already met with failure. While most of Harold Camping's followers were royally angry, embarrassed, and disappointed for being misled by his 2011 prophecy and its subsequent revisions, some of his former students saw it coming a mile away.
The whole world is under Judgment Day, and this is and it will continue right up until October 21, 2011, and at that time the whole world will be destroyed.
Camping had originally predicted the return of Jesus would happen on September 6th of 1994.
October 21st on your calendar, or not. Of course, Camping also predicted Doomsday in 1994.
He revised that date twice after each deadline came and went. But somehow his history of prophetic unreliability didn't dissuade people from trusting him, even with Daniel directly telling the reader when the end times were supposed to wrap up, even including a series of revised deadlines, just like we experienced from Harold Camping. The book had successfully latched into the public consciousness. Its stories of monsters and martyrs were here to stay, and other authors began borrowing from Daniel the same way Daniel's author had borrowed from older books of the Bible, like Jeremiah. Harold Camping changed the time of his prophecy's fulfillment, but he didn't change the content of his prophecy. With Antiochus dead and the revolt over, how could a reader rescue Daniel's prophecies? Antiochus Epiphanes had ruled over a Syrian offshoot of the Greek Empire established by Alexander the Great. Over the next few decades, that Syrian kingdom dwindled. To the west, the Roman Republic was growing in strength. They soon muscled their way in and took over the land of Israel. The Roman general Pompey, after conquering Jerusalem, actually entered the temple. While Pompey didn't loot the temple of its treasures, and he ensured it continued operations as usual, his entry into the holy building was a huge middle finger to the Jews. Eventually, the Roman Republic transformed into an empire.
So this is how liberty dies.
And the Romans allowed the land of Israel to remain semi-autonomous under a client king named Herod. A few years after Herod's death, part of his kingdom was incorporated into the Roman Empire as Judean province. It was during this era when Jesus came onto the stage of history. Judaism in the time of Jesus, like any religion today, was incredibly diverse. The idea that God would bring history to a close, restoring the dead to life to be judged alongside the living for an eternal punishment or eternal reward, has its origins in the apocalyptic worldview. While some factions within Judaism based their worldview around apocalyptic theology, they were always a minority, and not every Jew was familiar with the books of the apocalypse genre. Still, apocalyptic ideas had spread into nearly all forms of Judaism, and Daniel's popularity had kept the book around for a few centuries now. With Roman power replacing Greek hegemony, Daniel needed to be reinterpreted. The problem was not with Daniel's prophecies, but with us mistakenly thinking the end times were supposed to happen while the Greeks were still in power. That fourth and final kingdom would not be the Greeks, but the Romans. The Roman general's entry into the temple was a bright red flag that Daniel's prophecies were approaching the time of their fulfillment. Daniel might have made some prediction or another about Antiochus, but that guy was just a shadow of what was to come. The Romans would someday desecrate the temple in Jerusalem again, and that would kick off the end times countdown. We see this sort of expectation of Rome as chief villain for the end times in the literature written by an apocalyptic faction that had formed a commune near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. What is especially worth noting is that the Dead Sea Scrolls often refer to the Romans as Kittim. This shall be a time of salvation for the people of God, an age of dominion for all the members of his company, and of everlasting destruction for all the company of Belial. The dominion of Kittim shall come to an end, and iniquity shall be vanquished, leaving no remnant. For the sons of darkness there shall be no escape. The Dead Sea Scrolls also identify the Romans as Assyria, despite having no such historical origin. These names taken from the Hebrew Bible, Kittim and Assyria, were used for Rome in a symbolic way. The Romans were like Kittim because they came from across the water or sea. The Romans were like Assyria because they were a world-conquering empire. Between centuries of living under foreign rule and the rise of apocalyptic ideology, the Jewish homeland was a powder keg. When the Judean province was established in 6 CE, some people attempted to resist, terrorizing their more compliant neighbors with arson and theft. In the spring of 40 CE, the Emperor Caligula ordered that a statue of himself should be installed in Jerusalem's temple. He dispatched 2 legions under the command of a governor to make sure the decree was carried out. When the governor arrived in Judean province, he was met by thousands of Jews across the country, openly declaring they would rather die than let Caligula profane their temple. By summer, the governor had backed down on carrying out Caligula's order, but the event was traumatic enough that it stuck in Israel's social memory.
Luckily for Judea, Caligula was suddenly killed. A massacre was narrowly averted. But the episode sent a chilling message, and it reached the Jerusalem Jesus followers with ringing clarity. Roman power was all-encompassing. Any denial of imperial supremacy could be dangerous.
According to one theory, an apocalyptic student was convinced Caligula would fulfill Daniel's prophecies by the end of the year and wrote a tract outlining his expectations. When you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not be, let the reader understand. Then those in Judah must flee to the mountains. Someone on the housetop must not go down or enter the house to take anything away. Someone in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in winter, for in those days there will be suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now. No, and never will be. The author of the Gospel of Mark found this apocalyptic tract and put it in Jesus' mouth. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's often mentioned by commentators, and it helps illustrate the point on how readers continued to reinterpret Daniel over time in reaction to new events. Around the same time as Mark was being written, another apocalyptic teacher wrote a letter to his students, telling them how the temple would be desecrated one last time before the end of the world. That day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the lawless one is revealed, the one destined for destruction. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship. so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, declaring himself to be God. Even though Caligula had died before he accomplished his goal, the memory of his threat lingered in the decades that followed. It's no wonder anti-imperial sentiment and revolutionary thought was growing among the Jewish people. Their way of life was perpetually at risk with the Romans in charge. These tensions came to a head in 66 CE when Jews in Jerusalem, some of them led by the sons and grandsons of the resistance 60 years earlier, refused to pay taxes to their imperial rulers. The Roman governor reacted by looting the temple's treasury, an act which was met by outright revolt from the populace. Violence escalated until the emperor sent multiple legions to put down the rebellion. Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, and the temple was converted into a fortress for resistance leaders. Then it happened. Something Daniel had not anticipated. After 3.5 years of war and 5 months of laying siege to Jerusalem, the Romans broke through the city's final defenses. They burned the city down. The temple was not desecrated. It was destroyed entirely. And the wheel of history continued to turn. The Jewish people and their religion survived the war, but survival required adapting to this new world. An apocalyptic ideology which urged action against foreign occupation was dangerous. It didn't disappear, but it was dulled for a time. Worries about an imminent end of the world fell into the background as the apocalypticists joined their comrades in mourning the loss of the most holy place in the world. They wrestled with the trauma that God's own home on earth was now gone. The temple's purity had been threatened several times, but the complete destruction of Jerusalem and its temple had only happened once before, nearly 700 years in the past. Rome was neither Kittim nor Assyria. Rome was Babylon. The destruction of a temple for a god was widely understood across ancient cultures beyond literal terms. It was not just the earthly demolition of a building, it was an indication that the God who once resided there had decided to abandon his worshippers. A God permitting the destruction of his house was a sign that the God had given his favor to the destroyers. This was the temple of the chosen people. Had their God abandoned them? Could this be the end of their way of life? Of their world? When the end had come more than 2 centuries earlier, an imaginative thinker connected the dots found across the Hebrew Bible to explain how recent events were a part of God's plan. The author of Daniel overcame the war in his mind by reinterpreting the books of Jeremiah and other prophets. He spiritualized this prophecy, recalculated that one. He gave his new ideas to his peers in the shape of an allegorical myth. Wild animals prowling the earth. The lone human, once their prey, was rewarded for his suffering. We mentioned earlier that the most common trope of the apocalypse genre was for the author to pretend to be someone living in the distant past. Another frequent device in the genre was to encode predictions about contemporary events through symbolism. Daniel did this with his scenes of wild animals, a series of foreign kingdoms which held power over the Jewish people, were personified by a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a fourth, indescribably terrible monster. But Daniel didn't pull these animals from thin air. He was probably inspired by a specific source which mentioned them, such as Hosea, "So I will become like a lion to them, Like a leopard, I will lurk beside the way. I will fall upon them like a bear robbed of her cubs, and will tear open the covering of their heart. There I will devour them like a lion, as a wild animal would mangle them. Hosea 13. The author might have expected his readers to recognize where he got his idea from. He was speaking their language, a symbolic language which evolved of their scriptures and culture. So when Daniel elaborates that the fourth monster has 10 horns, both the number 10 and the image of a horn were already familiar to his audience, as having metaphoric use in the Hebrew Bible. The number 10 could mean many in a completionist sense, while a horn often represented strength. To say the fourth beast had 10 horns was one way of showing his readers that the last of the foreign kingdoms had far more power over the world than any kingdom which had come before it. The symbolism in Daniel didn't catch his readers' attention just because it was provocative and surreal, but because it was recognizable. Symbolism is only as valuable as it is intelligible to the target audience. And worth mentioning is that the Hebrew Bible was not the only source of these kinds of symbols. Any image, any myth, any story could be borrowed by the author if he expected his readers would recognize its meaning. This is the way all the ancient apocalypses need to be approached. They weren't high on mushrooms. They weren't tripping on rotten fruit. They were carefully articulate authors, but neither were they slavishly reproducing older ideas. They were reimagining them for a new context, and the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in 70 CE gave a new context like nothing else in 7 centuries. Some 30 years later, a trio of apocalypses were produced by different authors. These writers put pen to paper as a way to process the trauma of that catastrophic event just a few decades earlier. The authors may have witnessed the destruction with their own eyes. Today, these 3 books are known by the titles Revelation of John, 4th Ezra, and 2nd Baruch. The author of Daniel expected his readers to know his symbolism based on famous prophecies in Jeremiah, obscure verses in Hosea, and popular stories not even found in the Hebrew Bible. These 3 new apocalypses worked the same way. Each author was reimagining Daniel for a new context. These books were written in a visual language which readers could become fluent in as they read the Hebrew Bible, listened to popular myths and legends, and participated in everyday life. In other words, these books were constructed out of memes. Imagine you're having a casual conversation with your friends. Someone throws their hands in the air, jokingly yelling,
You're tearing me apart, Lisa!
If you've never seen the movie this quote comes from, the full meaning of what's being said will fly right over your head. Your ignorance of the meme causes you to miss part of the joke. Now imagine you walk in on your friends having a conversation where every single thing they say is a meme like that. You might recognize a few of the more popular jokes.
That would be great. Okay.
But maybe a lot of the things your friends are saying are pulled from movies you've never even heard of.
I do not care for hunky boys. Or do I?
You might find what they're saying funny, but you know you're missing something. Your ignorance of this mimetic language your friends are speaking isn't your fault, but it's a huge barrier to understanding what they're talking about in full. In a similar way as trying to talk to someone who is fluent in a language built from TV shows and movies, What would happen if you tried to read a book that was written by an author who took an enormous number of theological and mythological memes you're not familiar with, adjusted and modified them, and arranged them into a series of miniature stories without a coherent narrative flow?
Multiphasic transmissions overlapping, it's almost a gibberish.
That's the revelation of John, the final book in the New Testament. After 2,000 years of cultural drift, someone going in blind to read the revelation is going to miss what's really happening in the book. Even more so if the reader has a religious worldview which insists that revelation is totally unique, a worldview which actively discourages them from even considering ideas incompatible with their own existing theology. They are deliberately closed off from learning anything outside their curated bubble. So let's flip through the Revelation of John to get a quick overview of its plot, as much as it has one. The book begins with the author telling his readers that he received visions sent from God, visions which revealed how the end of the world was about to happen. The first thing the author sees is a shining human who says he will soon bring God's judgment on the world. Next thing the author knows, he's standing in heaven. He sees Israel's God handing over a rolled up scroll to a sacrificed lamb. The lamb opens the scroll, which unleashes war, famine, plague, earthquakes, and cosmic darkness.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria!
God sends out angels with trumpets and bowls of incense. For each angel that plays his trumpet or spills his bowl, a new plague hits the earth. Water turns into blood, locusts swarm the land, hell and fire fall from the sky. Then, the author's visions go a different direction. He sees God protecting a pregnant woman from a horrible, seven-headed dragon chasing her, vomiting floodwaters. The woman is taken to a secret place, and her newborn son is hidden by God so the dragon can't eat him. The dragon, furious that the woman and her son have escaped harm, gives power to a monster which crawls out of the sea. Like the dragon, the monster has 7 heads, one of which is killed with a sword, but comes back to life. Next to this feral animal, the author sees a second monster, this one climbing out of the earth instead of the ocean. The second monster forces the world to worship the first monster like a god. It performs miracles to prove their power and threatens dissidents with death. And riding on top of the monster's 7 heads is a prostitute, sleeping her way through the rulers of the world. When the monster's dead head comes back to life, it will turn all those kings against the prostitute, violently killing her. With the wild animal now in charge of the whole world, the sky suddenly cracks open. The newborn son returns, now a warrior king. He wipes out his enemies with a sword dangling from his mouth. The 2 monsters are thrown into an ocean of fire, and the dragon is chained up and imprisoned in a pit. The warrior king takes his throne, ruling over the earth. After 1,000 years, God decides the time for a final judgment has arrived. He raises the dead and creates a new cosmic order. The dragon and all sinners are dumped into the same eternal fire with the 2 monsters, while the righteous live in a city of paradise forever.
Striking story.
The Revelation of John reads like a fever dream, and even a lot of Christians don't know what to do with it. On the one hand, a lot of them wish it just weren't in the Bible. They're put off by the violence and the imagery confuses them, so they mostly ignore the book. On the other hand, there are a lot of Christians who obsess over it. They do their best to understand what they're looking at, but because this happens under the pretense of belonging to the one true religion, debates over the revelation regularly devolve into interpreters condemning each other for arriving at different interpretations. For example, take the two perspectives on Revelation called futurism and preterism. These two just might be the most popular interpretations of Revelation among American Protestant fundamentalists. What many futurists and preterists don't realize they have in common is that they're all struggling with the exact same type of cognitive dissonance we described earlier. The Revelation of John says that its predictions must soon happen because the time is near. But no one in the ancient world seems to remember all water on the planet turning into blood. The revelation of John's prophecies seem to have failed. But that can't be right. It's divinely inspired. It's in the Holy Bible. Spiritualizing a failed prophecy to protect it from itself is one of the most common ways of resolving this sort of cognitive dissonance. And both futurist and preterist resort to this strategy. Futurists insist Revelation is still waiting to be fulfilled in a more or less literal way, which requires spiritualizing those deadlines given by the author. They expect to see it fulfilled sometime in their own future, so they're often accused of trying to interpret the revelation by comparing it to the latest world events in the news. It's so obvious that when the author said the book would be fulfilled soon, he meant it how God understands soon, not as humans. 2,000 years seems like a ridiculously long time from a human perspective, but for God, it's only in blink of an eye. Futurism, prophecy is understood literally, so soon must be understood spiritually. Preterists come from the opposite direction. Soon means soon, and near means near. Otherwise, these words are meaningless and tell the reader absolutely nothing of value. So when the revelation says over and over that it must be fulfilled soon, the author meant exactly that. No, the problem is not that the revelation was unfulfilled, but that we've misunderstood it. All those visions are entirely, completely symbolic.
How did I miss it, Paul?
You have to read them with the right spiritual eye. Then you will see how they were fulfilled right after the book was written, way back in the 1st century. Preterism. Soon is understood literally, so the prophecy must be understood spiritually. What both perspectives do is begin with the assumption that the revelation cannot possibly make sense outside of their theology. These might make, for some, fun fiction books, but it's an enormous double standard when it comes to reading literature as literature. This benefit of the doubt isn't given to apocalypses outside the Bible. It's special pleading to insist the revelation is somehow exempt from being read with a critical eye. If we throw away such a flagrant double standard, what does the Revelation of John end up saying? When the revelation shows a lamb opening a scroll to unleash chaos on the world, the author was drawing from a well of stock disasters found across ancient literature. Apocalypses would infodump lists of these generic disasters. The goal wasn't to predict a nightmarish hellscape that would come thousands of years in the future, but to describe the author's present time as being so bad, it must mean the end of the world was near. Society is falling apart right now. So when you see these things happening, you'll know the end has come. There shall be chaos also in many places. Fire shall often break out. The wild animals shall roam beyond their haunts, and menstruous women shall bring forth monsters. Salt water shall be found in the sweet, and all friends shall conquer one another. When the author runs through his list of plagues from the trumpets and incense bowls, his most obvious source of inspiration is the book of Exodus. But because the author's visual language is so heavily based on the Hebrew Bible, he's able to put his own spin on these plagues, peppering them with images lifted from books other than just Exodus. For example, he sees a plague of locusts, but the Revelation's locusts are horrifying monsters. They look like war horses and have lions' teeth and long hair like women and wear golden crowns. One of the most popular futurist teachers from the 20th century was Hal Lindsey. His book, The Late Great Planet Earth, was one of the best-selling books in 1970s America, possibly the best-selling book of that decade. When most of the predictions in Lindsey's book became obsolete by the 1990s, he wrote a follow-up titled Apocalypse Code, updating his predictions for a new era. When he got to the Revelation's locust plague, Lindsey insisted the vision was a first-century man's attempt to describe attack helicopters. The phrase, something like crowns of gold, most likely describes the elaborate helmets worn by the helicopter pilots. The appearance of something that looked like a woman's hair could describe the whirling propeller that looked like flimsy hair. The term teeth probably describes the weaponry projecting from the chopper. You have to wonder if Hal Lindsey, a renowned expert on Bible prophecy, had ever really bothered to read his Old Testament. He doesn't so much as mention the book of Joel when talking about these helicopter locusts. Sometime in the 4th or 3rd century BCE, the prophet Joel predicted that Jerusalem would soon face an invasion. His book in the Hebrew Bible describes the devastation caused by the attacking army by comparing them to a swarm of locusts or a pack of lions. They'll jump across the countryside. They have sharp fangs. In context, it's obvious Joel was using hyperbole. Centuries later, the author of Revelation threw the book of Joel into a blender. The resulting chimera, a monster with body parts taken from locusts, horses, lions, and humans, is presented to the reader as if the author thinks it's a literal creature. And the Revelation wasn't even the first apocalypse to make a combination like this. His hair was spread out like that of lionesses. His teeth were outside his mouth like a bear. His hair was spread out like woman's. His body was like the serpent's when he wished to swallow me. The Revelation of John was doing what other apocalypses were doing. The author wasn't writing something incomprehensibly unique. But because the book isn't unique, that makes it easier for us to follow the author's creative process. The trumpet and incense bowl plagues aren't terribly interesting once they've been deconstructed. The author expected these wild disasters to happen, and by all accounts, they didn't. So let's skip over to the real draw of the Revelation: the dragon, the two monsters, the prostitute, and the 1,000-year rule of the warrior king. What both futurist and preterist agree on is that the evil characters are at least somewhat symbolic, representing the people in charge of the world during the end times, while the warrior king is literally the Messiah. Futurists don't leave us a lot to say because they're still waiting for the prophecy to be fulfilled. But preterists claim they can point to specific events in the past as having fulfilled the revelation. Where do they place it? in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. That's right, they think the revelation of John was written before Rome destroyed the city, not after. In their system of theology, the end of the world predicted by the revelation of John, by Jesus in the Gospels, by the book of Daniel, and every other book of the Bible, was a spiritual end that manifested through historical events. It was the end of Torah requirements, the end of animal sacrifices, the end of temple operations, the end of the Levite priesthood. When Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 CE, Jews wrestled with the question of whether God had abandoned them, and the preterist answer to that question is an emphatic yes. And why would God do this? The Jewish community, represented by Jerusalem and its religious leaders, had rejected Jesus as the Messiah. So God sent the Romans to punish them. Preterists find theological and biblical justification for their perspective. They believe Jerusalem's destruction by Rome is symbolized in the Revelation, with the monster killing the prostitute. But there is an obvious element of anti-Semitism in the claim that God permanently divorced himself from the very ethno-religious community which introduced him to the larger world. Unfortunately, criticism of the Jewish people is hardly rare in the New Testament, which has led to so many Christians overlooking just how much of a problem this sort of theology really is. Or worse, some Christians are entirely aware and don't care.
Antun tehelon di băinița de avudule Antun. Anazaku min dama dianashab.
Let's back up. Because apocalypses often communicated their ideas with dense symbolism, the author had to make sure his readers didn't completely miss his message. So another common trope in apocalypses was for the author to actually explain the surface level of his symbolism. The author usually did this by introducing an angel in the book to provide the explanation, but sometimes the author used prayers, songs, a voice from heaven, or even characters breaking the fourth wall within the symbolic visions. If all else failed, they would just give flat exposition through the narration directly to the reader. Then someone appeared standing before me, having the appearance of a man, and I heard a human voice calling, "Gabriel, help this man understand the vision." The Revelation of John uses this trope multiple times, informing readers that the dragon symbolizes Satan. The monster from the sea represents a world-conquering kingdom and its kings. The second monster represents a false prophet acting on behalf of that kingdom. And the prostitute personifies the city from which the world is ruled. This exposition gives us a silhouette for each of the four characters, so that exploring the smaller details will reveal who exactly the silhouettes represent. The dragon is not hard to misunderstand. You can't get much clearer than when the book says it's Satan. But why a dragon? Why 7 heads? Why does he chase a pregnant woman? Why is the dragon chained up in prison for 1,000 years, instead of immediately punished? Whether the author did it consciously or not, he was bringing together a wide range of mythologies in this character. There's a common misconception that Christianity came up with the idea of an evil angel Satan, where Judaism previously had no such concept. In fact, the apocalypse genre introduced the idea centuries before Christians came along. In the book called 1 Enoch, it is claimed that all sorts of worldly evils have their origin in a rogue faction of angels. When their rebellion against God's established order comes to his attention, the rogue angels are captured and imprisoned, forced to wait for their punishment at the end of time. Their leader, Azael, is wrapped in chains and imprisoned in a valley of darkness and jagged stones. First Enoch was clearly influenced by the Greek myth of Prometheus being chained down in Tartarus, the deepest underworld. The New Testament book 2 Peter, when summarizing these events from 1 Enoch, even calls the angels prison Tartarus. Over the next few centuries, other apocalypses gave the supreme evil angel names like Mastema, Samael, or Beliar. In the worldview of the ancient Canaanites, storm god Baal-Hadad earned the right to rule the pantheon by defeating the embodiment of chaos, a dragon named Lotan, who had 7 heads. This myth, a storm god slaying the dragon of the sea, changed over time. New storytellers replaced Baal-Hadad with another storm god, Yahweh, and the pronunciation of Lotan's name shifted over time, becoming Leviathan. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragon in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. On that day, Yahweh, with his cruel and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. Students of the Hebrew Bible will probably recognize the pregnant woman which the dragon chased. They might guess she somehow represents Israel or Jerusalem. Based on snippets they remember from Isaiah or Genesis or Exodus. This interpretation isn't out of the question. Other apocalypses also personify Israel as a suffering woman. I looked around, and on my right I saw a woman. She was mourning and weeping with a loud voice, and was deeply grieved at heart. Her clothes were torn, and there were ashes on her head. When I looked up, the woman was no longer visible to me, but a city was being built, and a place of huge foundations showed itself. But as the author pulls all of his influences together, rearranging them into a new shape, we start to recognize that he's leaning into yet another myth for his overall structure of the scene. Greek mythology said that when the goddess Leto was pregnant with Apollo, the dragon Python chased after her, intending to kill her son. Just like the pregnant woman in Revelation, Leto was divinely protected from the dragon, hidden away in safety. While the dragon is bluntly said to be Satan, readers who are willing to track down the author's influences will find he was not just borrowing from Hebrew scriptures. Appreciating the full depth of the Revelation's symbolism requires looking beyond just the Bible. The Revelations combined Leviathan and Azael decides to give power to a wild animal that crawled up from the ocean. It's obvious this monster is a reimagined version of the fourth beast from the book of Daniel. But Daniel's fourth monster could no longer be identified as a Greek kingdom. It didn't exist anymore. So what world power came after the Greeks? For the book of Daniel to remain true, interpretations had to be updated to make sense with the latest historical events. The Revelation wasn't alone in trying to reshape Daniel according for a new context. Those two contemporary apocalypses, 2nd Baruch and 4th Ezra, were doing the same thing. After that, a fourth kingdom arises, whose power is harsher and more evil than those which were before it. In the Revelation, the monster has 7 heads, resembling its satanic patron, giving the reader a sort of double Leviathan, except the monster's heads aren't just a remnant of an ancient Canaanite myth. In 4th Ezra, an angel explains that the monster's heads represent the rulers of the final kingdom, during which time the Messiah will arrive. I saw rising from the sea an eagle that had 12 feathered wings and 3 heads. I saw it spread its wings over the whole earth. The eagle that you saw coming up from the sea is the 4th kingdom that appeared in a vision to your brother Daniel. And 12 kings shall reign in it, one after another. But the second that is to reign shall hold sway for a longer time than any of the other 12. As for your seeing 3 heads, this is the interpretation. In its last days, the Most High will raise up 3 kings. These details about the beast and its 7 heads are the biggest clues to the reader what the revelation of John is really getting at. Amid all the swirling visions of angels and plagues, this is where his message is heading. A showdown between God's kingdom and the Roman Empire. Messiah versus Emperor. But which emperor did the author expect would be the last? The revelation tells its readers how one of the 7 heads of the monster was killed, but would come back to life. An emperor will die, but will be resurrected. All people will bow down to this emperor when he is raised to life, but his grasp on power will be short-lived as the end times are brought to their conclusion. In fact, the monster itself is one of those emperors represented by the 7 heads. The beast is not just the Roman Empire as a whole, but also one of its emperors in particular. This brings us to the mark of the beast. It is the wild animal's name, or the number of its name. Here is wisdom. Let the one who has perception calculate the wild animal's number, since it's a man's number, and the number is 666. For all the jokes and paranoia,
the time has come. Execute Order 66.
This number has been wildly misunderstood, not just in pop culture, but even in so-called prophecy experts. In some ancient languages, such as Hebrew and Greek, which the Bible is written in, the letters of the alphabet were also used as numbers. Names, words, even whole sentences could be turned into a number by tallying up the value of each letter and adding them together. The name of Israel's King David equals 14. So when the Gospel of Matthew provides Jesus' genealogy as the son of David, the genealogy is divided into 3 sets of 14 generations. In Pompeii, one of the cities destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, we discovered graffiti which secretly refers to people by the numbers of their names. One example says, "I love her whose number is 545. The popular riddle in the late 1st century was that the name Nero equaled 1005 when spelled with Greek letters, Neron, which just so happened to be the same number as the sentence killed his own mother, Idian mitera pektine. Take a guess what the Roman Emperor Nero was infamous for having done.
He killed his mother.
Because symbolism was such a common trope in apocalypses, it was only natural that some of them would play with these number codes. The Sibylline Oracles predicted that the city of Rome would be destroyed after 948 years, just falling short of a full millennium of power. Because when the name Rome is spelled with Greek letters, Romi, it equals 948. The Sibylline Oracles also repeatedly identified Roman emperors by the number of the first letter of each of their names. 3rd Baruch claimed that 409,000 giants died in Noah's flood. Because when the Greek word for flood, kataklysmos, is spelled with Hebrew letters, it equals 409. The mark of the beast is primarily the name of the monster and only secondarily the mark of the number of its name. The meaning of the number must be calculated because, as the author tells us, the number belongs to a man. He tells his readers that if they're wise enough, they can decipher the name behind the number. In other words, 666 is a number code for the name of that man, the emperor, who is the beast, who died and would come back to life. While he was writing the Revelation, the author was playing around with number codes, trying to find something he could use to identify this emperor. He discovered that by sheer coincidence, both the Greek words for beast, therion, and the Greek spelling of the name Nero Caesar, Neron Caesar, equals 666 when spelled with Hebrew letters. The Emperor Nero is the beast, almost literally.
There have been attempts to interpret the number 666 other ways. Some take it as a reference to an obscure part of the Hebrew Bible, which says 666 talents of gold was one of King Solomon's annual sources of income. But this view requires ignoring what Revelation explicitly says. The number 666 calculates into a man's name, not how much money he made in a year. Likewise, some gloss over that the number is 6 hundreds and 6 tens and 6 ones. They try to read it as a series of 3 individual sixes. And since the book of Genesis says that God made humans on the 6th day of creation, the number 666 means that all humans are sinful, falling short of that perfect number 7, or in this case, 777? It's hard to see how such a generic interpretation of the number 666 could require the careful wisdom the author tells his readers they will need. It's true that throughout history, Christians could never really agree what the mark of the beast was. But this is true for the whole book. In fact, for its first few centuries, many Christians thought the Revelation of John was a forgery written by a heretic named Cerinthus. It can fairly be said the book almost didn't make it into the New Testament canon. For those who thought the book was authentic, only a rare handful of people thought it talked about Nero. Today, a few scholars such as G.K. Bill point to this rarity as a reason to reject identifying 666 as a coded reference to Nero. They claim that the required spelling of Nero's name in Hebrew is more or less a recent invention to make him fit. When the exact spelling turned up in an ancient Aramaic document, such scholars have to strain against the cumulative weight of the evidence. They even argue that because many wild theories have tried to attach 666 to just about any major political or religious figure in history, from Adolf Hitler to Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, it somehow means the number isn't a code for anyone's name at all.
You'll never find out.
The Revelation's description of the mark of the beast is nearly a textbook definition of those number codes. Contemporary apocalypses don't universally agree who would be the grand villain of the end times. But those books which attempt to reveal his identity agree it would be a specific Roman emperor. And they tell us which emperor they had in mind with detailed biographical clues, including easily crackable number codes. They say he will come from the lineage of Emperor Augustus. Then Beliar will come from the Sebastyanoi. Greek Sebastius equals Latin Augustus. They say his name begins with the number 50, which in Greek was the letter N. One who has 50 as an initial will be commander, a terrible snake, breathing out grievous war, who one day will lay hands on his own family and slay them, and throw everything into confusion. But even when he disappears, he will be destructive. Then he will return, declaring himself equal to God, but he will prove that he is not. They say that he murdered his own mother, as Nero had done, Beliar will descend, the great angel, the king of this world, which he has ruled ever since it existed. He will descend from his firmament in the form of a man, a king of iniquity, a murderer of his mother. Some ancient copies of the Revelation say the number is 616. Why? An early reader appears to have understood 666 was the number of the Greek version of the emperor's name, Neron, but deliberately changed it for the benefit of their local community, who knew the emperor by the Latin form of his name, Nero, without the extra N. 666 drops by 50 to become 616. The idea that the final ruler of the world would be a satanically empowered Roman emperor, specifically an emperor who had died and would one day return to life and seize power through conquest, is not unique to the revelation of John. A man who is a matricide will immediately seize the one because of whom he himself perished. There's really only one candidate who fits all of the criteria in Revelation and was known to the author and his original audience. The author of Revelation, like some of his peers, believed the dead Emperor Nero would soon be revealed to the world alive. He had ruled, was now dead, but would return to life so he could retake his empire and force the whole world to worship him. Revelation says this worship would be enforced by a second beast, this one crawling out of the earth instead of the sea, distinguishing the two monsters as coming from the sea and the earth might imply a literal origin for what they symbolize. If the Roman Empire came from across the Mediterranean Sea, maybe the second beast was something more local for the author, unlike most other apocalypses, which were written in or about the Jewish homeland. The Revelation places itself in Roman Asia, which is modern-day Turkey. If the second monster was local for the author, we need to identify it with some entity which existed in Roman Asia, contemporary to the author and his readers. While it's possible the author meant for the geographical origin of the two monsters to be taken literally, it's more likely he wanted to show the oceanic Leviathan joined by his earthly counterpart, Behemoth. These two monsters show up together in the book of Job, and ancient teachers thought they would have some role during the end times. And Behemoth will reveal itself from its place, and Leviathan will come from the sea, the two great monsters which I created on the fifth day of creation, and which I have kept until that time. And they will be nourishment for all who are left. Where Apocalypse is like the Ascension of Isaiah or the Sibylline Oracles said Nero would perform supernatural acts to help trick the world into worshiping him as he ruled like a god, the gathering together is near when some deceivers, in place of prophets, approach. Speaking on earth, Beliar also will come and will do many signs for men. The Revelation of John splits these details across two monsters. The false prophet Behemoth performs dark miracles as it forces the world to worship the kingly Leviathan. The author probably had in mind the imperial cult and its priests, Roman authorities who presided over the state religion, which included worship of the emperors. The Revelation says that when the beast is restored to life and seizes control over the world, he will turn his anger against the prostitute, whom the author names Babylon. For any Jew living after 70 CE, Babylon could be used as a code name for only one city, Rome, the capital city for which the empire was named. Rome was given this code name because the Roman and Babylonian empires uniquely shared in common what they had destroyed, Jerusalem and its temple. When the Apocalypse for Ezra was written near the end of the 1st century CE, around the same time as the Revelation, its author said he was writing some 30 years after Babylon, i.e. Rome, had destroyed Jerusalem. 2nd Baruch does the same, also using Babylon as a cipher for Rome. The Sibylline Oracles directly mention Rome by name when calling it Babylon. The New Testament book 1 Peter, a letter forged in the apostle's name, implies it was written in Babylon, connecting it to the early Christian belief that Peter moved to Rome in his later years and died there. Against this, some people reading the book, especially preterist Christians, think Babylon refers to Jerusalem. When the beast destroys Babylon, they read this as a description of the Roman Empire destroying Jerusalem in 70 CE. After all, Revelation's description of the prostitute's murder by the seven-headed beast is obviously inspired by Ezekiel 16, where Jerusalem is portrayed as God's adulterous wife. But remember, Revelation lifting ideas from other sources doesn't mean the author was regurgitating those sources. The vision of the pregnant woman being chased by a dragon was influenced by the myth of Leto and Python. But the Revelation clearly doesn't intend for readers to identify her newborn son as the Greek god Apollo. The author was inspired by his sources, but he was a creative writer in his own right. In any case, the Hebrew Bible does refer to foreign capital cities as prostitutes on occasion. At the end of the 70 years, Yahweh will visit Tyre, and she will return to her trade, and will prostitute herself with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. Because of the countless debaucheries of the prostitute Nineveh, gracefully alluring mistress of sorcery, who enslaves nations through her debaucheries and peoples through her sorcery. The book's version of Nero's death and imminent return are also difficult to place within the year or two after his suicide, or even before it, as some preterists argue. This legend makes the most sense when given a few decades to develop and become recognizable throughout the empire, precisely in the same time period when we find the legends appearing in other apocalypses. If it's not obvious enough, the name Babylon refers to the Roman Empire's capital city in the apocalypse. 3 other details should make it clear. First, the author says Babylon is a city which rules over all the kings of the world. What's the most common way of rescuing a failed prophecy? By spiritualizing it. 1st century Jerusalem was a famous city, but in no way did it rule the world, not even in a spiritual sense. We have to really stretch those words to make them fit Jerusalem. Second, the Revelation provides 2 interpretations of the beast's 7 heads. They don't just represent the Roman emperors, they also represent 7 hills, and the city Babylon sits on those 7 hills. Rome was famously known throughout the empire as the city of the 7 hills. Illustrious Rome will bound her power with earth, her spirit with Olympus. She will enclose her 7 hills with one great city wall. Therefore, he will also destroy many for the city of 7-hilled Rome, on account of the mighty kingdom, the heights of the city of the 7 hills, which presides over the world. In fact, the specific picture of Rome as a woman sitting on 7 hills first appears in history on coins minted in 71 CE, after Jerusalem had already been destroyed.
But use your eyes, your common sense.
And finally, the Revelation says the beast will turn against Babylon and destroy the city after he returns to life. The amount of time necessary for this elaborate legend about Nero to develop would mean Jerusalem had long since fallen, while Rome still stood. Some versions of the myth said that when Nero retook the throne, he would do so by invading. bringing armies from the barbaric outside world against Rome. Then the strife of war, being aroused, will come to the west, and the fugitive from Rome will also come, brandishing a great spear, having crossed the Euphrates with many myriads. A man who is a matricide will come from the ends of the earth in flight and devising penetrating schemes in his mind. He will destroy every land and conquer all and consider all things more wisely than all men. He will immediately seize the one because of whom he himself perished. And this is exactly what the revelation of John shows. The world's forces submit to the seven-headed beast and assist him in killing the prostitute. The author believed Nero would return to life, invade his former empire with barbarian hordes, and crush his capital out of spite for having been forced out of power in the first place. At this point, all that's left is the arrival of the Messiah to face off with the world ruler and armies.
Battle between good and evil to the death!
The shape of this final scene in the revelation of John, the defeat of the Roman Empire, the formation of the Messiah's kingdom, and the final judgment is almost identical to what we find in 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch, and has broad similarities to the expectations of other Jewish and Christian apocalyptic thinkers. The Messiah is revealed from his secret hideaway, sometimes followed by an army of angels or holy Israelites. For my son the Messiah shall be revealed with those who are with him. And it will happen when everything that should come to pass in those parts has been accomplished, that the Messiah will begin to be revealed. And then I will sound the trumpet out of the air, and I will send my chosen one, having in him one measure of all my power, and he will summon my people. The Messiah will conquer the world's armies. He, my son, will reprove the assembled nations for their ungodliness, and will reproach them, and will destroy them without effort. When the nations are moved and the time of the Messiah comes, he will call all nations, and some of them he will spare, and some of them he will kill, and will drag Beliar and his armies also into Gehenna. He'll defeat the final emperor with the power of his spoken word, sometimes symbolized as a sword or fire coming from his mouth. Whenever his voice issued from his mouth, all who heard his voice melted as wax melts when it feels the fire. And my Messiah will convict him of all his wicked deeds, and afterwards he will kill him. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will destroy with the breath of his mouth, annihilating him by the manifestation of his coming. God's kingdom will rule over the whole world, with the Messiah sitting on the throne as God's regent. The Messiah will rule for decades, maybe even centuries or millennia. For my son the Messiah shall be revealed with those who are with him, and those who remain shall rejoice for 400 years. After those years my son the Messiah shall die, and his dominion will last forever until the world of corruption has ended. Avimi, son of Rabbi Abuhu, taught, the Messianic era for the Jewish people will last 7,000 years. After the Messiah's rule comes to an end, God will make the world like new. The dead will come back to life, and God will command sinners to be tortured in fire. But the righteous will be rewarded with eternal paradise. The pit of torment shall appear, and opposite it shall be the place of rest, and the furnace of Gehenna shall be disclosed, and opposite it the garden of delight. The shape of those who now act wickedly will be made more evil than it is now, so that they shall suffer torment. Also, as for the glory of those who prove to be righteous, The shape of their face will be changed into the light of their beauty, so that they may acquire and receive the undying world which is promised to them. Early Christianity was originally an apocalyptic, messianic faction within Judaism. They were waiting for an explosion of catastrophes and violence across the world. It would be a short but intense time period which would bring history to a close and initiate a new order, converting the whole world into a kingdom for God and His chosen people. These ideas developed out of the Jewish nation's history of being subjugated under foreign empires. Imaginative thinkers poured their resentment for the second-class treatment of their people into their literature, writing brutal prophecies about divine vengeance and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. But under the surface of those books was a centuries-long attempt to correct the unfulfilled predictions of each generation which came before. Every major historical development was an obstacle to accepting the legitimacy of those ancient prophecies. Jeremiah, claiming God had decreed Babylon would rule the Jews for 70 years, had failed. A few centuries later, Daniel came along and tried to update Jeremiah's prophecy, but the end result was that Daniel's own prophecy failed as well. And a few centuries after that, books like 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, and the Revelation of John attempted to do the same for Daniel. 4th Ezra failed in this attempt. So did 2nd Baruch. Why should we assume the Revelation succeeded before we even read it? We hope that you enjoyed this documentary. I hope it made an easy to understand picture of how Jews continued to use prophecy, kicking the failed prophecy down the road, trying to fulfill it again, believing God would come in and vindicate them in their unjust situation, and helping you to identify in this coded symbolic language of Revelation that we are dealing with Rome and Jerusalem in the context. It is not all about Jerusalem as much as preterists wish it was. Christians have a very difficult time with eschatology. There are various forms of it, and I have traveled through them, as has the person who helped script this, Mark Edward. We have seen what Christians have attempted to do to make sense of the Bible and how the end is supposed to make sense in their minds. At the end of the day, we, along with the critical scholars, think that it failed and it didn't happen. I hope you liked this video. Subscribe to the channel. Consider joining our family by becoming a YouTube member and join our Patreon. We can use your support to keep producing these valuable videos. I'm also planning on doing monthly hangouts on Zoom with those who help support us on Patreon. Also, if you want to take your education further, we have courses by the best scholars in the world on mvp-courses.com. Go and expand your mind, deepen your understanding, become a mini expert in these areas that the scholars are teaching on the website. The links are in the description. I hope to see you there. Share this with all of the prophecy pundits that are out there, and let us know what you think in the comments section. Thank you, and never forget, we are Myth Vision.